you want to check that you've got screen sharing rights?
Yeah, I can do that. Let's see. Does that work? Thumbs up if it does. Okay, perfect. So thanks again, everyone, for making time to be here. It's nice to be able to get together with everyone remotely, even. Hoping that sometime soon, who knows, maybe in the next 5 years, we'll be able to get together in person. Mark asked us to think about sort of lessons from learners and what learners might have to say about effective digital learning experiences informed by the pandemic and informed by earlier sort of work. So I thought I would share sort of a Canadian perspective based on a piece of research that we completed a couple of months ago. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge that Royal Roads University, my institution, as well as the neighborhood where I live, are on the traditional lands of the Kwasapsum and Lekwungen ancestors and families who have lived here for thousands of years. And as a new Canadian, I'm grateful to work and live here, and to acknowledge these lands is to sort of acknowledge the need for conciliation, the harm that colonization has done, not just on Indigenous people here, but all around the world. So with that, I'd like to talk about this study that we did where we essentially attempted to capture sort of student responses to the pandemic in Canada based on institutional surveys that were conducted from the start of the pandemic up until about 6 months ago. There's about 200 public institutions in Canada, and we developed sort of a systematic process to go through and identify surveys that institutions did where the audience were students, and then release those results publicly. We were able to identify about 22 surveys that we were able to gather, the full report, and we tried to identify any sort of materials that were accompanying that. So original instruments, original data, anything that we could get our hands on. So why did we try to do that instead of conducting, say, our own survey, instead of conducting, say, a survey at our own institution or a pan-Canadian survey? Well, the idea was to capture sort of emerging findings that institutions were capturing and releasing. And as part of my work sort of focuses on this idea that we need to understand students and as people and not just as students, we tried to sort of hone in this different surveys that we identified to look at whether institutions themselves were trying to capture data, not just about online teaching and learning, but about everything else that was happening around students' lives while they were going through the pandemic. So, their frustrations, mishaps, life-changing experiences, all of that, we're trying to figure out and put it into sort of one perspective. We also thought that if we're able to capture sort of common experiences and look at the different instruments, we would be able to generate opportunities for cooperation and collaboration. For example, if we're able to identify really good instruments from one institution, we will be able to point to that and say, okay, look at that. You can also, use this instrument, or you can compare your results to this results if you use the same one, and so on. Over half of the surveys that we identified were limited to a single institution. The rest were sort of pan-Canadian instruments from a number of organizations and institutions that serve different institutions. So, for example, the Canadian Association of University Teachers, which is the organization that university faculty belong to in Canada. Most of these surveys were focused on graduate students. Some of them examined undergraduate and graduate students. There was one survey that only looked at international students. And I'm going to talk about the themes that we discovered next. Not all of the surveys covered all of the themes, but nearly all of the surveys mentioned all of the themes to some degree. We found that student concerns were predominantly focused on sort of 4 areas. First, there was the quality of education experience during what's come to be called emergency remote teaching and learning. Nearly all surveys examined student educational experiences. They examined perceptions related to social experiences as they relate to their learning, to student learning. They examine accessibility in terms of both technology and disability, quality and value of the education that students received. And there are specific or sort of special attention to these surveys, typically around the delivery format, the quality of content, the availability of courses, and student motivation. There was also quite a bit of focus on access to necessary resources, specifically around access to libraries and access to labs. The second theme that was pronounced in these surveys was around mental health and well-being. Many students in the surveys noted that they experienced a decline in mental health. One of the national surveys, for example, that was included indicated that about 60% of students were worried about the pandemic. One college reported that a large number of students were struggling with isolation and loneliness. And then nearly 40% of students at one of our large public institutions reported symptoms of psychological distress. The other theme that we identified centered on financial concerns. About 37 to 35% of students surveyed noted financial concerns. One national survey noted that such stress was not sort of evenly distributed across students. Economic and health concerns, they noted, were higher amongst women than men, higher among visible minority students, higher with students living on their own than with roommates, and higher amongst those with no personal income. And finally, a lot of the surveys touched upon, sorry, I moved my slides here. A lot of the surveys touched upon sort of the impact of the pandemic on students' future plans for education work. Essentially, in summary, students were by and large concerned about everything from if and where they'll be able to study, when they will be able to return back to campus, what kinds of impact the pandemic would have on their future work prospects, on their immediate careers, as well as on their long-term career prospects. Finally, all of this was wrapped up in the surveys with recommendations, typically from students, but often from institutions as to what institutions should do to accommodate some of these areas of concern. Recommendations often center around providing financial relief for students, making more academic accommodations available, improving mental health supports, and providing greater flexibility, both within courses, but also in being able to access educational opportunities. And for us, this essentially said, or highlighted one issue that I'd like to share here. As you saw in my previous slide, these themes are wrapped around this idea of recommendations, right? And they're sort of interconnected. So what the main sort of idea for future research that came up for us was the idea of approaching the results and our future research with sort of a relational and ecological mindset. So for instance, when we talk about financial insecurity, we realize that this cannot be divorced from sort of mental health and anxiety, right? Divorcing the student experience, what makes for effective online learning is difficult to break it up from the experience of declining mental health during the pandemic or anxieties about the future. So this perhaps is the most important implication that comes out of our research. And we recognize that our field often tends to examine online distance learning at sort of the micro level, right? In the context of the classroom, in the context of a particular technology or a particular intervention, attempting to divorce that experience from the broader environment. So our sort of single biggest recommendation would be to consider in future research to pay more attention to how the broader environment impacts our practices. And there's a number of ways to do that. And there's a number of ways in which relational or ecological approaches might be helpful to us. One important way, for example, that was also evident in some of the surveys, is that a handful of surveys sort of highlighted the difference for students of different backgrounds and ethnicities. But this was not the focus of the majority of the surveys. And given the disproportionate effects that the pandemic has had on different individuals, for example, individuals who are Indigenous or Black or people of color in Canada, it's important for these differences to be identified and delineated so we can figure out ways to respond to them. So how to do this in future research, and essentially how to think about equity, diversity, and inclusion, is to think about this at the early stage of the research, sort of at the research design stage. For example, we could consider including mechanisms where we can disaggregate our data, your data, by diversity-related variables, right? Consider how the knowledge of different diversity variables could help us figure out, which kinds of students need which kinds of support, so we can support different students in the kinds of ways that could be beneficial to them. We can think about this as well in terms of the kinds of audiences that our research is trying to reach. Typically, we write our research for our colleagues and for different kinds of journals. But in thinking about equity, diversity, and inclusion, sort of from the beginning, we can imagine different ways that we can mobilize our knowledge to reach the kinds of individuals that could benefit from having access to it, right? So for example, if these surveys were designed in different ways and produced in different ways, they could reach administrators, they could reach instructors, they could reach student societies that could benefit from those results. So I'm going to pause there and pass on the microphone to Mel, I believe, but I'll be here and I'll be able to answer questions unless Mark has a different design.
Yeah, George, I might just come in. I think there's a comment just posted now, so you may want to look at that, or if you can multitask. I've only just glanced at it myself, but I thought I'd ask you a methodological question since you sort of touched on this before we get into maybe some more practical aspects.
Yeah.
Can we really capture the student voice through survey research?
Yeah, that's a great question. My answer would be no, you can't. And to do so, we would need sort of a multi-methodological approach to it. And as you, Mark, and others here probably are familiar with my research, I often advocate, capturing that student voice by getting closer to students, meaning doing deep inquiry studies, interviews, ethnographies, that kind of thing. Having said that, what we tried to do here was to sort of quickly figure out what students were telling us from the data that was emerging. That doesn't necessarily give us the full picture, but it's data that we can make use of, and it's data that can inform sort of our ongoing work.
Thanks, George. If you want to stop sharing the screen, Melissa can probably start loading her slides. I wanted to just give you the opportunity, because you're a humble person, your book, which tells stories and narratives about the student experience, is very powerful. And I guess that's what you touched on, that the importance of numbers and narrative together can amplify the experience. So speaking of numbers, I'm going to hand over to Melissa, not necessarily to suggest that we're going to hear more about quantitative research, but certainly about the literature and what it might tell us or might not tell us. Hopefully that's enough segue, Melissa, for you to take it over from there.
Yes, actually, that's perfect. And I have to admit, I've just done a sneaky shuffle of a couple of my slides simply because of having heard George talk about his research this evening. So I hope you don't mind. And I know I've probably got too many slides. So do, give me the old winky wink, nudge, nudge when you want me to stop talking, because I do have a tendency to run over. So I'm looking at the time. and I'll try not to run over time. So I wanted to just give a quick little background. A lot of the work that I've been doing, in particular, I also actually graduated, received my PhD last year through a very online situation just like this for my Viva. My PhD was really looking at student engagement and educational technology, predominantly for K-12, but also in higher education. And through a lot of synthesis of prior research that's been conducted, I conducted a number of systematic reviews. It actually led me to develop this bioecological student engagement framework, which I thought I'll quickly pop in here, just so it gives you a little bit of context from where I'm coming from. And it links really nicely to what George said about maybe looking at things with a little bit more of a relational or ecological mindset. So this is a student engagement framework adapted from Bronfenbrenner and colleagues. And as George said, you know, a lot of the time we're looking at this microsystem kind of interplay between these different factors here in the microsystem and how they relate to the student experience. And we also don't necessarily take into consideration at the same time these nested, interconnected layers that impact on students and their experience. And so through not just conducting my own empirical research in my PhD, also through doing systematic reviews and synthesizing the research, the great plethora of research that we have out there already, led to starting to come towards this kind of understanding in my own work. We've also been conducting through the pandemic, my colleagues and I have been conducting a number of systematic reviews, mapping reviews, but also rapid reviews. So they are systematic reviews that have been conducted very quickly and often involve some kind of, I guess, minimalization of certain steps within the process. And I wanted to focus on a couple of those questions here in this particular review. So this was a review that we conducted looking at the teaching and learning that was happening during the COVID pandemic, particularly in that first European summer semester. So from, you know, sort of the early first half of last year. And we were looking at what the characteristics were of the research that was being conducted, the methods used and the topics studied. And we also looked at what kinds of technology was being used. Now, I will just say before I talk about what we found that we do have a number of other, I guess, follow-on work from what we've already started. This was only really scratching the surface. And we've continued to work on this, and we'll be looking at the student experience in more depth in our future work. But what we found, we synthesized 282 studies from around the world that were either published in English, Spanish, or German. And we found that in terms of the sample of the research that was being conducted, it was primarily focused on students, but particularly the undergraduate student experience. We found that research really only looked at the instructor side of things in around a third of the studies. And there were also relatively few studies that used smaller sample sizes, so less than 25 participants. And that's compared in particular to the research that was happening in the K-12 sector, where that was a much higher proportion. We also found that the faculties of health and welfare and natural science, maths and statistics were really heavily represented, whereas other faculties were far less so. In terms of the focus of this research, certainly student perceptions of online learning and emergency remote education did, constitute quite a large part of it, followed by the impact of the shift to online learning and teacher perceptions. But we did find that in terms of the methodological approach, you know, as George has already alluded to, quite a small percentage of that research was conducted using more qualitative methods. In terms of the technology that was used, we found that, unsurprisingly perhaps, half of the studies were using synchronous collaboration tools. So things like, live video conferencing like we have here right now. Closely followed by learning management systems and multimodal production tools like things such as YouTube clips or perhaps instructor recorded videos and things like that. We found that, it seems that one of my slides hasn't saved. Oh, my apologies. We certainly found that the rate at which synchronous collaboration tools were being used and were far greater than research that we'd conducted pre-pandemic. And it was really quite surprising what we didn't find. In some cases, that was more surprising than what we did. We also, as George has already mentioned, we found that these studies weren't necessarily looking at topics like ethics or the experiences of vulnerable groups, or, as George said, the diverse student populations that we have, or looking at students within their own personal environments. We also found that not a lot of depth was gone into in terms of explaining how technology was used with the students and their experiences of emergency remote education, and that certain details were lacking from reports of study design. As indicated in this interactive evidence gap map I have here on the screen, we were quite surprised that there were far fewer studies that looked at the use of data analytics, the use of assessment tools in particular, as well as social networking tools during that the first period there during the pandemic. As I've already alluded to, postgraduate students were far less researched, and we certainly found quite an unbalanced distribution of countries in terms of both location for authors and participants. Whilst also admitting, of course, we are constrained by the search strategy that we used, and that we were predominantly looking for those three languages. I've probably got a couple of minutes left. I did also conduct some research with colleagues looking at research that was happening in K-12 during the pandemic as well. And I just wanted to mention, I won't cover everything, but I did just want to mention that whilst recognizing that you can't compare necessarily like with like, we can't necessarily compare these completely different studies that happened pre-pandemic to those that did happen during this coronavirus crisis. But I did just want to point out that in terms of the indicators that were found of student engagement, noticing that although the engagement indicators during the pandemic were a lot lower than pre-pandemic, we did find that the disengagement indicators at least weren't overly explosive, that they did certainly show that impact of social disengagement quite strongly. We also found with the school literature that there was quite a bit of a gap in terms of looking at social networking tools, looking at assessment tools, which, given the kinds of conversations that happen here in the UK, for example, around standardized assessment and things like that, was really quite surprising. I could go on and talk about this till the cows come home. I won't. But I will reiterate what George said and say that in terms of where to go from here, we're going to be exploring the student experience in far greater detail. We're going to be looking at evidence in terms of those engagement indicators as to what occurred during the pandemic, and also look at it in relation from that bioecological perspective in terms of those different interconnected layers. So I will stop talking and stop sharing.
You're fine on time, Mel, so don't worry.
I always get told off.
Elaine is all queued up to go, but a couple of questions. There's one there, at least from Simon in the chat box. He asks, are any of the research instruments benchmarking respondents' epistemological perspectives, individuals' orientation to knowledge, cultural perspectives on values, etc.? So there's a package of things there you might want to respond to briefly.
Right, very few. To be honest, this first mapping review that we've done, we really looked, because we did it in such a quick way, we didn't go into great depth in terms of the survey instruments, but from what we've seen already, certainly no great depth there in terms of what was collected. I know that in the K-12 research that we looked at, there were hardly any variables in terms of students' backgrounds, in terms of, we actually only found, I think it was 5 studies that specifically included students with special educational needs and disabilities, let alone more diverse, questions on diversity and cultural perspectives and things like that. But that is definitely something that we're going to be looking at in this next stage.
Okay, well, I think we will, in light of time, just keep going, and that'll leave us a bit of time at the end for some three-way sort of Q&A. As a bit of a segue and a picking up on what both George and Mel have already talked about, I'm not sure what Elaine's actually really talking about. So Elaine, this is something to give you to work off at least. We're also involved in a European Commission funded project looking at literature on the student experience, and particular student readiness for online learning. One of the things we have seen is just a couple of publications come through co-authored with students. And in part, that was what I was getting at a little bit with George about how the student voice can come through. So I guess the segue to you, Elaine, is how efforts that we've been involved in, because I'm part of some of the work that you're going to describe, have tried to bring the student in quite a practical way. So over to you, Elaine.
Yeah, thank you very much. And luckily, I do intend to speak about that project and about a number of other ones that we're involved in. I'll just share my screen to get started. Okay, so firstly, most of my most recent work relating to the online student experience stems from the MOOC, a Digital Edge Essentials for the Online Learner. So I will just start by telling you a little bit more about this course very briefly before I share some of our research insights and the lessons we've learned along the way. So this course was developed and launched in September 2020 by DCU in collaboration with the Irish Universities Association and DCU Students' Union as a response to the COVID-19 pandemic. It was initially funded by DCU COVID-19 Research and Innovation Hub, but more recently the initiative has evolved and has become a core element of the EU-funded Digital Pro strategic partnership, and this has given us the opportunity to offer further iterations of the course. I suppose the premise of the course is that online learning is not the same as learning on campus or face-to-face, in that it requires a different set of skills to master. And we wanted to give new and continuing higher education students a resource to support them in developing these skills. And these skills are increasingly being considered to be important life skills, not just in the context of the pandemic, but also beyond. The course is offered hosted on the Future Learn platform. It is free to anyone, anywhere in the world to register and take part in. It is 2 weeks long, and it takes approximately 3 hours of learning per week, so a relatively short course. It's currently in its 3rd iteration and has over 10,000 learners enrolled to date. In terms of the content, it is anchored in the LifeCom framework and the OECD Learning Compass. The instructional approach is influenced by the design principles that underlie the Future Learn platform, which promote visual learning, learning through conversation, and storytelling. But I suppose uniquely, the central ethos of the course is that it is designed for learners by learners. So this is where we're trying to bring in the learner voice as much as possible. We had a cohort of learners who had experienced learning online and contribute to the content itself through audio clips and testimonials, sharing their experiences of different challenges that they experienced when learning online and offering their responses and lessons learned from those experiences. We also asked students to review the course before it launched. And when the course launched, we had a group of students who had experience learning online co-facilitate the course alongside the educators, and they were able to respond to students' questions and queries from their own perspective as a learner. And this really enhanced the course and encouraged conversation at a level that the instructors probably wouldn't have been able to reach themselves. And they became the core facilitators in many cases, and they have been evident on all 3 iterations so far. So it's been a great experience in that regard. The course feedback was overwhelmingly positive to date, and here's an example of one of the posts on screen here from the learners in the final section. We asked them to reflect on what they've learned and what they found most useful in the course. And Deirdre in many ways was representative of other learners in that she appreciated the social nature of the course and that she found she learned a lot from her fellow learners. And that's something I'll come back to again when I talk about some of our lessons learned. Currently, I just wanted to touch on this, is that the first year students in DCU who complete the MOOC can earn a digital badge, which is recognised as part of a wider DCU Engage Award. So this encouraged many students to take part and engage in the course. But like I said before, it wasn't just for DCU students. But as part of our involvement in this in national multi-campus micro-credentials project, which is called Microcreds, and it's being led out by the Irish Universities Association, we hope to develop this course into a digital skills micro-credential with different elements of digital skills. So it would be a combination of other courses as well moving forward. So this is something that we're thinking about. I suppose most relevant, I think, to this talk is some of the research that we've conducted as part of the course. And we used it as an avenue really to delve into the student experience, predominantly prospectively, so before they had engaged in the course and before they had started their online higher education experience. Firstly, the research was conducted throughout the course itself via interactive polls, such as these highlighted here. So in these cases, we asked students about how they were feeling about being an online learner. And then we also asked them about the aspects of online learning that they were most concerned about. And these types of polls were purposefully incorporated and interwoven into the MOOC at various points. And they had they had dual purpose. Firstly, to help keep the instructors and facilitators abreast of the student perspective and state of mind with regards to different topics, but also they acted as an emotional regulation tool for the learners as they were presented back with the high-level results anonymously, and they were able to see that many other students were feeling the same way that they were about the different aspects of online learning. And I'll delve deeper a little bit more, as I said, into that now. So another strand of research was that we conducted additional optional surveys pre and post course. So quantitatively, we looked at the influence of the course on online learning self-efficacy. And then qualitatively, we delved deeper into the emotional experiences of the students themselves as they prepared to start this new experience of online learning in a higher education environment, having potentially not intended to do so, as was the case with a large proportion of our students. I suppose in the next few slides then I'll just run through some of the results of these two strands of research. Firstly, with respect to online learning self-efficacy, we found from paired sample t-tests that we found significant increases in all 4 dimensions of our online learning self-efficacy following participation in the MOOC. The scale we used in this case was an adapted version of the Zimmerman and Kolakovich scale for online learning self-efficacy. I suppose these results tell us that following their participation in the MOOC, students reported feeling more confident in their ability to navigate the technological aspects of online learning, and more confident in their ability to communicate in an online environment, more confident in their ability to manage their time while learning online, and learn then without being in the same room as their instructor or peers. And the largest effect size related to self-efficacy to communicate online, which aligns nicely and is hopefully attributable to the pedagogical approach adopted in the course, which is focused on learning through conversation. So there was those, and that's one of the sources of self-efficacy posited by Bandura, which is that you can develop self-efficacy through participating in similar activities. So this course would be a form of experiential learning in that sense. Then from the emotion side of things, we asked them from the get-go how they're feeling about the greater focus on online learning as a result of COVID-19. And unsurprisingly, the vast majority of them were feeling anxious. But then we asked them to expand on why they were feeling that way. And we conducted a thematic analysis of those open-ended responses and identified 7 overarching themes or sources of emotion. Now I have to apologize in advance. I only realized as I was logging on that this was quite a blurry slide, so I'll try and talk through it as best I can for you. So our first theme, I suppose first of all, these themes give us a greater insight into the student preconceptions of online learning, predominantly as they were responding prior to any participation in the MOOC or higher education in an online learning environment. So the first theme is perceptions of ability. So students expressed doubts about their ability to stay motivated and avoid distractions as they were studying from home. And they also expressed doubts about their ability to keep up to date with communications, which they said were coming from many different avenues and people. And then many of them expressed concerns about their ability to achieve their learning goals in an online environment, with many of the opinion that it would be harder for them to learn online. The second theme is technology. Many of them were concerned that their lack of digital skills would impede their learning success. And they were also worried about practical elements such as unstable internet connections and the reliability of wider infrastructure in the university, as many had experience of systems crashing and falling out of sessions. So very practical concerns in that regard. Another source of emotion was related to the students' confidence that they had in their university to be able to provide the teaching and learning support that they would need in an online environment. So this related to the faculty's digital skills and support provision. So anxiety was experienced by those who questioned their access to supports in an online environment and whether their quality of teaching would be the same in this environment. Others who were encouraged by their efforts so far were more likely to kind of express feelings of hope about learning in an online environment. Then we have perceived advantages and disadvantages of online learning, and naturally positive emotional responses stemmed from perceived advantages, and these included the flexible nature of online learning, the ability to learn at your own pace in that regard. Then we had the opportunity to learn new skills and kind of professional development in that regard. And then another advantage was the monetary and time savings associated with not having to commute to campus. And this was a source of positive emotion for learners. The primary perceived disadvantage and source of anxiety for students was the lack of opportunity to socialise with others. And this came through predominantly among first-year students who had no higher education experience and were really concerned that they wouldn't make new friends. And it was as simple as that. The final source of emotion then was related to communicating and interacting online, and they expressed concerns over the practicalities of group work, which is interwoven into the majority of our modules in DCU. And they questioned how fruitful discussions could be if they were in a class of over 100 people and they were trying to contribute to a moving thread of chat. So very insightful in that respect. taking then all of this together, I pulled out kind of some overarching takeaways or lessons learned along the way. And the first one is derived directly from the development of the MOOC. And this reflects the need to give students an opportunity to have those important conversations and learn from each other by sharing experiences. If we develop out the courses too much, there's no time or space for those kind of conversations. So there's a need to just, and I know Mark talks about this, and he has previously when we talk about, is the need for designing for emptiness and giving students the chance to have important conversations about the content and creating that content along the way as they do that. The second one then relates to the importance of considering the wide spectrum of digital and other online learning related competencies in the student body. And naturally, socioeconomic variables come into play here. And this suggests that some students will commence their higher education with a lower level of digital learning capital than their peers. And additional supports may need to be provided for those that don't have the necessary skills and resources along the way. And we would suggest that something like the MOOC would be a useful intervention in that regard. There's also then the need to develop a clear and consistent communication strategy with students in the online environment so they know exactly when and where to find the information. Students are extremely concerned that they were going to miss deadlines, not attend live synchronous sessions because they didn't have links, they didn't know where to find them, things like that. And then we have the value of social interactions for students. And social interactions in this regard can be incorporated into your live lectures by giving students the time to take out 5-10 minutes to chat among each other, or it can be facilitated outside of teaching hours via our platforms if possible. And then the final point is the value of fully leveraging the flexibility afforded by online and distance provision. And this flexibility can be incorporated both into instruction and assessment. And when that happens, the students really seem to respond very well in that regard. So before I'll finish up very quickly, I'm very conscious of the time, but I just wanted to summarize, and this is what Mark was talking about, some of our work that that's taken part in the Digitel Pro strategic partnership, and DCU is leading out on a digital readiness work packages for students in this project. And then one of the activities is an initial kind of a systematic review of empirical research conducted during the pandemic in digital readiness and digital preparedness among higher education students. Now, we did employ strict parameters, but some of our initial findings indicate that there is a lack of student voice in this research. We also found, with it being predominantly quantitative scale surveys that was conducted, we also found that many of the authors were new to the field of online learning when they were publishing about digital readiness, and were not engaging in the wider literature or more recent conceptualizations of digital readiness. And they were focusing on like access to devices and internet, which is obviously a part of the concept, but not the whole picture. So in that regard, I'd actually be really interested to hear from the other panelists and participants about whether you think this is something that you've seen more widely in COVID-related research, both in the student perspective area, but also more widely as well. So on that note, I will finish up.
Thanks, Elaine. And if you would just stop sharing the screen, thanks.
Yep.
We've got about 5 or 6 minutes for a little bit of Q&A. So I want to pick off one of the questions from Jenny Poskett. Good to see you here, Jenny. Jenny asks about the sort of balance in design between asynchronous and synchronous. And just to preamble the question for all three of you is, I guess, in a general sense, distance online education prior to the pandemic was very much focused on asynchronous delivery, and emergency remote teaching in a general sense was very much about synchronous delivery. So that's my kind of cue to any thoughts you might have about that balance, where synchronous fits, where asynchronous fits. So who would like to take that away first? Jump in.
I will. Well, I mean, we found that a lot of the research was reporting that that balance between using both, as Jenny said, having both asynchronous and synchronous, and having that as a complement. I mean, we found that the emergency remote education experience was, it was that real social isolation that people were feeling, that they really needed that extra opportunity to have synchronous learning embedded in their experience at both like school level and at higher education level, and that those, the research in our systematic reviews was reporting that they really craved that opportunity for that social interaction, not just for their learning and different types of learning activities, but also to have that sort of more social time, a little bit of social time at the beginning and at the end, if possible, to connect with peers, to connect with the instructor, as well as, having it for learning as well.
George, can I just direct a follow-up sort of question? You can interpret this in the previous question as well. You've written some really quite challenging work just recently around the concept of flexibility. And I'm wondering, where does synchronous delivery fit with flexibility? Is that an oxymoron?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in the paper that Mark is referring to, we essentially argued for institutions and instructors to adopt sort of a radical flexibility lens in not only delivering courses, but also in their design. But we noted that radical flexibility means different things to different people, and it might serve different audiences in different ways. And when I speak about this, I often remember of this incredible story that Malcolm Gladwell tells about tomato sauce. He says that there was I can't remember the name of the individual, but this individual was essentially going from conference to conference to executive, telling people that there is no perfect tomato sauce. There are perfect tomato sauces, perfect for different kinds of people. There's chunky sauce and spicy sauce and runny, and different kinds of people prefer different kinds of things according to their taste preferences or whatever. And in this context, it's quite similar to saying, well, different kinds of people need different kinds of experiences to accommodate the complexities that they have in their life, right? And their immediate needs. Like, I don't need to meet with someone in real time to tell me how to fix my leaky faucet when I can just go on YouTube and spend 2 minutes and figure it out. But I might need someone to explain to me, some complicated theory that I'm trying to understand how to apply to my research project, or I might need to work in real time with a collaborator in figuring out the budget for a project and so on. So what does that say? That says that, coming up with sort of uniform solutions for all of the kinds of learners that we have is really difficult, and that we shouldn't really aim to do that. What we should aim to do is to figure out different kinds of solutions for different kinds of audiences. And, some courses might specialize in asynchronous delivery and some might specialize in synchronous delivery. But that ability to mix and match, I think, is important. And it's complicated at the institutional level, right? Because when the institution tries to sort of adopt a single mode or a single approach.
Turning my mic back on here, know your learners, I suppose, which is a sort of a fundamental aspect of learning design. We're just coming up to the end, folks. Elaine, do you have one last final word, since I've asked you to stay up so late tonight? UK time or Irish time?
I suppose it's definitely, and I pick up on the point in the comments about, you know, there's an element of listening to the learners, but then there's also proven methods of teaching and learning in an online environment. But you still have to be open to their perspectives, and research and has also shown us that in many cases they've found their own workarounds for many of the tools and resources that we provide, and they can have their own experiences and they're just as valid in the experience. And online learning is in many cases giving them the opportunity, and learning in general and teaching in general is giving them the opportunity to have those conversations, and I think and share those experiences. And I think that's one thing I'd like to push, I think.
Well, thanks, George, Mel, Elaine. I think one comment that came through, or a question we didn't get to answer, was about the concept of emptiness, but you touched on it there at the end, Elaine, where there was a very good Irish survey, a national Irish survey, that asked students what digital tools they use for their learning, and they identified about 600 plus tools. When the academic teaching staff were asked the same question, they identified less than 200. So that emptiness in the MOOC that Elaine has described allowed the students to tell us all sorts of things we didn't know. And I know methodologically, in some research that I did in another life back in New Zealand, where we used video diaries of first-time distance learners, the same message came through. There were so many things that we didn't know that the learners were able to tell us. So I guess next time we have a follow-up, we will have to have some learners here live to be telling us. And that's perhaps one of the things we're guilty of, talking about learners without having their voice really here around the table. I apologize for that. It was something we tried to pull together if we could, but it's not easy working across time zones and other things. So folks, we're just a minute over time, so I think we'll call it a night, a morning, an afternoon, depending on where you are. And we hope you've enjoyed the session. This recording will be available in due course on the APODE website. So good night. Have a good day.